Hey everyone, so let's continue where we let off here, and that's with disturbance theory. So, disturbance theory is this theory that explains the origin of interest groups as a response to when a particular right or interest becomes threatened. So, think about, for instance, Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood really emerges. Actually, this is quite an old um, interest group. So maybe that's not the best example. But we can definitely find an example here in the National Rifle Association. Now, in 1871, when the National Rifle Association was created, it truly was just kind of a sportsman's club that began to change in the 1970s when, as a result of what was perceived to be an encroaching threat on the Second Amendment, the National Rifle Association really transformed itself from this sporting association to this political advocacy network. Now, why are there so many interest groups? There are over 22,000 today, and there are so many lobbyists. There are about 12,000 lobbyists. There could be even more in shadow lobbying. Now, that sounds particularly sinister. What on earth is shadow lobbying? Shadow lobbying is a practice of influencing lawmakers without registering as a lobbyist. Now, there's one very explanation, a very simple explanation for this. Money. There's a lot of money involved in this. Now, why is there so much money involved in this? Well, the Constitution allows it with this division of government. There are simply more places where influence can be effective. You are now not only influencing politicians at the national level, but the local level and the state level. There's also a diversity of interests. We've covered that. And a simply more active government. Government is doing more than it used to. Consequently, there are many more interests involved. Now, this is data from the Center of Responsive Politics. Let's take a look at how spending of lobbying has changed over time. As kind of a rule, it's gotten bigger, but it's never been small. You might think, oh, something happened in 2019. No, that data is just incomplete. It hadn't been finished for the rest of the year. You see here, you have a lot of people involved in this practice. Now, how does this work? This chart is pretty noisy. So let's just start here with an interest group. An interest group, um, group of people. Excuse me, guys. I need to take this. Okay, that call was not what I thought. It was a telemarketer. So let's continue here. We have an interest group, and first they mobilize public opinion. They can do that by giving interviews with the media, they can release a favorable research findings, and they can get on these public relations campaigns. They can also coordinate with reporters to get their story and their interest out there. Now, these news stories and editorials favorable to an interest group can eventually get to members of Congress who cave to this influence and act accordingly. But that's not the only way this works. An interest group can go to constituents whose jobs are affected, and these constituents can send letters, emails, phone calls, all sorts of things to these members of Congress. Now, interest groups can also directly go to members of Congress. They can create a PAC, a political action committee. They can give endorsement. They can testify that members of Congress are acting according to their interests. Now, they can also go kind of the old fashioned way, and that's work a network. And this is not unlike any other profession. If you know somebody who knows somebody, it's easier to get your advice through. So, gaining access and information The development of personal contacts and ties with congressional staff can get that information to Congress too. They can also go to other members of Congress who will try to ally with the targeted member. So, a very complicated chart, but a good reference point if you're ever confused as to how this works. So, what do interest groups do? They play the inside game. Lobbyists can talk to politicians directly, and this requires access and it requires a knowledge of how the Senate works, how the House of Representatives works, and who is who in it. Now, that is why very successful lobbyists are often retired senators or reps. They are people who know everyone already in the Senate. Now, this works best with very narrow or technical issues because that's where that specialized knowledge of how the House and Senate works is going to be very important. This takes place usually outside of public view. It takes place in people's offices. It takes place in restaurants in Washington, D.C. And it's not always as sinister as it sounds, but politicians do think that this is a problem. So here's where members of the last Congress are now. They're in lobbying firms, or they are lobbying clients. Sometimes they go to private organizations, and some become members of Congress again. But you see, so many retired members of Congress just go straight into lobbying. Now, congressional staff who are former lobbyists, take a look at this. A lot of congressional staff members are former lobbyists. And it looks like, if we look at this, here it looked like more Democrats than Republicans had lobbyists. And now it looks like more Republicans have lobbyists than Democrats. That's just to show you this is not really a partisan thing. Everyone hires lobbyists. Interest groups can also play the outside game. They can mobilize people outside of the government. We call this grassroots lobbying. When you go back to that chart, that is mobilizing public opinion, mobilizing your members, mobilizing constituents, organizing around a congressional person's district, and influencing them that way. Now, what do interest groups do? They can shape opinions. They can get out the opinion on issues and individual members of Congress. They can also, excuse me, they can also issue report cards, ranking candidates to support for certain issues. They can send direct mail, other advertising, and they can encourage political activism. Let's see this interest group breakdown. So, by far, the largest interest group spending is finance and insurance. Defense is often talked about very shadowy, but you see, the defense interest group budget is not that high. There's a few reasons for that. We can talk about it in class. Now, this is just another slice of it. You see here that there's a lot of ideology in single issue interest groups. Think about right to life groups. Think about abortion groups. Think about special interest groups in terms of like, oh, these big cleavage issues that are in line with what we call single issue voters. Here we go again. The same data presented a different way. Certainly, it seems now that more Republicans than Democrats have certain lobbyists in their staff. The only place where Democrats seem to have Republicans beat is in communications and electronics and labor, which makes a bit of sense. Now, we will start a discussion on the iron triangles in the next video.